Hey, Salt House, Pastor Ryan here. Hey, I want to introduce a video here for you of a paper that I wrote about 5 years ago. And so just as a little bit of a background to it, it was before that time, just before that time, that a friend of mine, Dr. Stephen Michael Newby, invited me to write a musical with him. And it was to be set in Detroit, 1969, a place of his birth where he lived, and in those neighborhoods where mass rioting occurred, something that he was really familiar with and was introducing me to. And so that began for me a journey of discovery, and which then led me to, in my master's work at the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology, to write a paper that really was for myself and for the white church, to help us understand. At that time, it was in Ferguson, the writing was in Ferguson, to understand the writing in a different way. So this paper is called A Theology of Riot, and it's born out of discussions with Dr. Newby, and with conversation partners in the books of James Cone and others, and it specifically takes a look at a passage from the Bible. And you've probably heard me talk about this passage before, and it's in Luke, and it's the triumphal entry of Jesus and the cleansing of the temple, and then the occupation of the temple that follows. And it tries to see this in a new light and see how the Bible speaks to our modern day situation, and our modern day situation speaks into the Bible, and to be in conversation with it. I showed it to a few people and said, do you think this has resonance right now? And a number of people said, yeah. You should put this out. So that's what I'm doing. I hope it's helpful in some way, as me as a white person am trying to do my work about discovering bias within myself and the system that I'm living in. I hope to have that conversation with others as well. So please, with great humility, I offer this piece to y'all. So one of the chants during the protests in Ferguson stood out to me. It was a call and response. It said, "Show me what theology looks like." And the response was, "This is what theology looks like." And this, I think, left a lot of people in the white church scratching their heads thinking, what in the world does this have to do with theology? And it kind of exposed this divide in the church, right? The theologian James Cone published his seminal book, Black Theology, Black Power, in the aftermath of the Detroit riots of 1967. That's what the pictures in this slideshow are of. And James Cone wrote this: that most churches see an irreconcilable conflict between Christianity and black power. It's evidenced not only by the de facto segregated structure of their community, but by their typical response to riots. I deplore the violence, but sympathize with the reasons for the violence. Strange, right? Churchmen, laymen, and ministers alike apparently fail to recognize their contribution to the ghetto condition through permissive silence, except for a few resolutions which they usually pass once a year or immediately following a riot, and through their co-tenancy of a dehumanizing social structure whose existence depends on the continued enslavement of black people. The driving question for my project was this: is there a way for the white church to see the riots in light of biblical narrative? Is there some way in which we can see that this might actually equal this in some way? So what I attempted to do was this: reconstruct Jesus' triumphal entry and temple cleansing scene in the Gospel of Luke in order to find places of comparison with the 67 Detroit riots, and to do this in conversation with James Cone. I chose Luke's Gospel for 3 reasons. As many scholars have noted, including the renowned Dr. Rutherford, Luke is particularly keen towards the marginalized. Through
Luke's narrative structure takes the Gospel of Mark and it does something really interesting with this narrative structure. Where in Mark, Jesus enters Jerusalem, kind of looks around the temple, decides it's getting late, and goes home to cleanse the temple another day. Luke combines this narrative into one very forceful stream. He's just going right in with the people, and he goes right into the temple. And then, lastly, Luke has material in the story that's unique only to Luke and gives significant insight into Jesus' motivation for occupying the temple. And I have time to only offer one of these kind of aha moments. So let me set the scene for you. Imagine that a whole mob of people have followed Jesus in from all the surrounding countryside. Jesus has made camp on the Mount of Olives, a place that's historically, politically, and prophetically charged. And the crowd, they're chanting this coronation psalm, Psalm 118, but they further politicized it in Luke by changing "Blessed is the one" to "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord." And it is with the disciples' protest chant that the Pharisees take issue. They give this order to cease and desist. They say, they say to Jesus, "Teacher, order your disciples to stop." And Jesus says this very well-known quote here, "I tell you, if these were silent, the stones would shout out." Now think about the songs, maybe the sermons that you've heard reference this verse. How has this verse been understood? Yeah, nature cries out. If we don't praise God, all creation will, right? This is a really beautiful idea. I have nothing wrong with this idea. This is not what Jesus is talking about here. Nearly every commentator I read missed Jesus' quotation of Habakkuk 2 here. Jesus is reading Habakkuk 2. I don't know if you're reading Habakkuk 2. Jesus is reading Habakkuk 2. I want us to look at it real quick here. We're going to do a Bible study here, okay? Because I want to see what is motivating Jesus in this temple cleansing. So let's look at it. Look at the proud. Their spirit is not right in them, but the righteous live by their faith. Moreover, wealth is treacherous. The arrogant do not endure. They open their throats wide as Sheol. Like death, they never have enough. They gather all nations for themselves and collect all peoples as their own. So what is the prophet asking us to look at here? The proud, the wealthy, the arrogant, they're greedy even on an international level here, right? They're gathering all nations to them as if they owned them. And so immediately we see there's an element of ethnic oppression to this indictment. Reading on, "Shall not everyone taunt such people, and with mocking riddles say about them, Alas for you who heap up what is not your own. How long will you load yourselves with goods taken in pledge? Will not your own creditors suddenly arise, and those who make you tremble wake up? Then you will be booty for them, because you have plundered many nations. All that survive of the peoples shall plunder you. Because of human bloodshed and violence to the earth, to cities and all who live in them." So notice here that this violence done is towards city dwellers. There's an urban context here, right? And what's the violence that the wealthy, arrogant leaders of the city are committing? What's the nature of this violence? I mean, to me, it looks like a corrupt credit system, right? That is subjugating a marginalized immigrant population. And then what's the prophet's warning to the oppressors here? Watch out, the city dwellers you have plundered through a corrupt credit system shall plunder you. Right? There's an element of right here. It points us back even to the plundering of the Egyptian oppressors in the Exodus when they're leaving Egypt. Okay, now we're getting to it. You ready? "Alas for you who get evil gain for your houses, setting up your nests on high to be safe from the reach of harm. You have devised shame for your house by cutting off many peoples. You have forfeited your life." Now we come to the quote. "The very stones will cry out from the wall, and the plaster will respond from the woodwork." So where do the proud, wealthy city leaders live here? Tucked away, huh? Gated mansions bought with corrupt money. And where are these crying stones? And what do they cry? Right? So when the Pharisees tell Jesus, tell this mob to stop and desist, what does Jesus say? If I do that, all the earth will make beautiful music to the Lord. No! Through this prophetic imagery, Jesus tells them, if we don't cry out against your injustice, then your own gated mansions will. The cry of the stones is a cry of protest. The temple is exposed as being in bed with the empire, which has led to the devouring of widows, exemplified by the widow who gives her last penny to the treasury, the very institution that God gave for the widow's protection. See in the next chapter. So, in 1967, there were riots all over the country. The worst was in Detroit. President Lyndon Johnson put together the Kerner Commission to answer the question, why in the world did this happen, especially in this model city of Detroit? Topping their list of answers was housing. Pent-up frustration over the poor, segregated living conditions available to African Americans. And before 1910, 91% of blacks in the U.S. lived in the South. During World War II, defense-related factory jobs drew blacks northward, and by 1967, 45% of blacks lived in central cities outside of the South. The black population of Detroit doubled between 1940 and 1950, and realtors sold homes along invisible racial lines. Banks refused to give blacks loans to purchase or build homes in white neighborhoods. Public housing was segregated all the way up until 1960. And even though discriminatory laws had been overturned in 1960, the city was then more segregated than it had been 30 years prior. So why did the riots happen in Detroit? Why are there riots today? Stones are crying out. So what Luke actually says about the temple cleansing itself, it's short but precise. Then he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling things there. Let's try to think about this scene very pragmatically. Where did this crowd go that was following Jesus? Did they wait patiently outside while Jesus went in and cleansed the temple? And think about this, what happens when the money changers' tables are flipped over and all the coins just go rolling out into a crowded temple court? Remember, this is the bank of Jerusalem. This is Fort Knox here that's getting knocked over. Doesn't this smack of Habakkuk's looting of the looters to you? And what would happen if one single person tried to run out all the vendors, say like down here at Pike's Place? What if one person just went in and tried to just run all of those vendors out of there? And believe me, the temple court is much larger than Pike's Place. You wouldn't get far, right? Unless this is like a proper miracle, but the text doesn't seem to say that anyway. So therefore, it's only reasonable to conclude that Jesus was not acting alone here. Motivated by compassion, Jesus joined with the prophet Isaiah, who dreamed for an integrated place of worship that welcomed the outsider and cared for the poor. My house will be a house of prayer for all peoples. And motivated by justice, Jesus joined with the prophet Jeremiah in his anger over unjust housing, unjust credit system, racial segregation, and abuses of power. Right? But now, this is a den of thieves. These are topics at the heart of modern-day dreams and frustrations that, when constantly thwarted, erupt into riot. As the crowd was marching on the temple, Jesus stopped, and he grieved, and he wept. He looked over the city, he said, if only you knew the things that make for peace. If only you recognize your time of visitation from God. But you don't. And that will mean the destruction of this temple and of this city. What if the riots that the white church deplores as senseless acts of violence are actually a thing that made for peace? What if they are a visitation from our God? When asked, is there any hope for the white church, James Cone said this, Hope is dependent upon whether the white church will ask from the depths of its being with God, what must I do to be saved? The person who seriously asks that question is a person capable of receiving God's forgiveness. It's time for the white church to ask that question with a willingness to do all for God.